Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the Book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 17 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 20. So we left off in the middle of this dramatic event where the people have gathered around the base of the mountain. Moses and Aaron have gone up to talk to God. Big happenings going on, right? And then in this lesson, we cut to primarily the conversation that Moses and Aaron had with God, which is a very one-sided conversation. It is entirely a one-sided conversation. An interesting thing here that we'll address again when we get to a similar but different version of something like this is that this is the one that has the 10 Commandments, and there's nothing carved onto tablets, and there are no tablets. This is a conversation or a monologue from God to Moses and Aaron. It's spoken. God speaks to them. Later, just Moses goes up on the mountain and things are carved onto tablets, and it's implied that it's this. But we'll get to that. We'll deal with all of that on the second pass. For this one, it's just worth noting there are not tablets here. This is not that event. It is just shockingly similar to that event, but it is spoken. Which matters. So it's worth, as we dig into this before we get into the specifics of these commandments, spending a little time digging into the concept of law and what it is. So we're going to do that by way of setup. We've got several points to dig into. First one. There are different categories or kinds of speech or language. In the introduction to the first volume of Jesus of Nazareth, Benedict XVI talks about especially the idea of performative speech, which is, we've got your normal just, I said something and I'm describing something, right? You use language and you use it to describe a thing that is the case. Performative speech, by contrast, is speech that affects the thing that it says, right? It changes something. The thing that you say is the thing that comes to pass. The most common example is, with this ring I thee wed, right? You say that and it does that when you say that. The speech itself creates or affects the thing that you say. Law is another type of language. It's a thing where it has to be backed up by an authority, but then when that happens, it creates these boundaries that going outside of bears penalties or consequences, right? It's just words, but it's also not, because it's backed up by some authority, and that makes it more than just words, right? Like here we see thou shalt not kill in this law, and we'll talk about how this one works more, but we also have laws against different kinds of killing with different penalties for different kinds of killing. It's a lot of words. And it is all just words, except that it is backed up by an authority, the authority of our government and our legal system, and by mutual agreement of citizens and people in this country to abide by that law. Right? There are things that especially an overriding authority that makes laws more than words. Right? And the efficacy of the law depends upon, and the justice of it, and everything about whether it's good or bad, it works or doesn't, is all dependent upon the authority that backs it up. We also have laws that are not necessarily exercised or enforced all of the time and effectively become meaningless, right? For all practical purposes, the real speed limit, we all know, is higher than the one that's posted because it's not enforced. If you're going 1 mile per hour over the speed limit, you are very unlikely to ever get a ticket. If you're going 30 miles per hour over the speed limit, you are very likely to get a ticket. And there's some gray area there in terms of variable and even inconsistent enforcement of the law. And with, at least in the state of Iowa, with 9 miles per hour over being not a moving violation and 10 miles per hour being a moving violation, there are additional penalties that come into play for a certain amount of violations, so that gets enforced more, etc. There's this whole system around it, but the enforcement is inconsistent, dependent upon the one that enforces it, and the letter of what's written and the practical state of what's enforced don't match. That shows that from a point of view of human laws, what is written is not necessarily always binding. But that's due to problems with the authority and not problems with the law. We're not dealing with that, right? Because what is the authority that is backing up this law? It's God. So what makes this matter isn't the words, it's the one speaking them and backing them up. It's that this law uniquely comes from God, which makes it different from every other law in that it will never be inconsistently or variably enforced. And it won't ever be overlooked either. It will be enforced. So there's that side of it. There is the broader question of why is God issuing laws? This is the first real speech or directive God has given to his people as people. Before it's been to individuals, right? Like Abraham, go do this. Moses, it would be great if you went to Pharaoh and did these things and then went and talked to all these people and got them to come with us out into the wilderness. We're transitioning from just having individual relationships between God and people and having a group relationship between God and people. And this is the thing that God has told the people to do. Or more specifically, the thing that God has told people not to do. And why is that? Next point. So in his letter to the Romans, St. Paul talks about the law quite a bit in the first 4 or 5 chapters of the book. And interestingly points out that this is insufficient, which I think is not a point that God would disagree with. It doesn't by itself bring salvation. And he argues, and I'm going to disagree or add some color onto what he's saying, he kind of points toward the idea that all this is able to do is damn people. And he's not wrong, but consider the state of these people right now as this law is coming to them. Are they in God's good graces, in a state of grace, bound toward heaven, in good shape in terms of their immortal souls? No. And that matters tremendously also, right? This isn't a thing that happened like the first instance of law in the Bible, don't eat fruit from that tree. In that case, Adam and Eve were in a state of grace, and they were in a good relationship with God. And the violation of that law severed that relationship. This is not that, because the relationship is already severed. So St. Paul's point and the context in which he's making the point are very valid, and it's a good and it's an interesting perspective. But I would put forward, this is not going to damn anyone who doesn't keep it, because they're all already damned. So it's not doing that, right? The penalty for not keeping it is already in existence for everybody who's getting the law. So it's not here to penalize. The punishment's already been given and is continually being given to all of these people. So it's a weird thing. Like if you gave a bunch of people in jail laws that said, you better not do this or you're going to jail. That's this, right? Like these people are damned and dead, and it's saying you better not do this or you're damned. Which raises the question, well, how is that relevant to me? I'm already damned. Which is what makes this such a fascinating thing that's occurring. What is here is the fascinating implication of, but what if you kept it, right? Like, so you're starting from a place of being doomed, but what if you didn't have to be? This introduces the idea not of punishment, death, damnation. This introduces the idea of life. It suggests that there is a way to create a relationship with God that leads out of death and into life. And this is God speaking that way to his people. How that works for us as people, and this is with all of the Word of God, not just the law, but any of it, is it's not enough to hear it, right? Like, I think that's a mistake that we make, right? Like, yeah, I heard and I listened to the Word of God, so like I'm good, right? No, you have to do it, right? Like in some regards, and that's why the concept of law, it's hard to narrow down in the Old Testament what the law is, because everything God tells you you're supposed to do, right? There's no part of what God tells you that you're just supposed to hear and say, oh yeah, that's interesting, and move on, right? Like, but we do that, right? We read and study the Bible and say, oh yeah, that's interesting. Anyway, what was I doing? All of this is meant to be done. And if it is done, it contains within it the possibility of taking something that is dead and making it not dead. By virtue of these things that God has spoken, right? God's word has the effect to bring dead things to life, but it doesn't do it on its own. It only does it with full and perfect cooperation of the people who are hearing it. To further build on that point, these 10 commandments in particular, most of them, there's a structure, right? Skipping the fact that, the first ones that are more God-focused start a little not in that structure, and we'll get to it. If you think of the commandments, you're generally thinking of what structure? Thou shalt not stuff. By and large, the substance of these commandments is negative, right? Like not negative bad, but like negative, like the absence of a thing, right? They're carving out and they're stopping certain behaviors. what does this do practically? Because again, I don't think anybody is going to find the pathway, and Jesus reiterates this point later, right? Nobody's going to find the pathway to salvation by just not doing stuff. Because that salvation is dependent, as we later learn in Christ, or at least is clearer and more reinforced that way, on our relationship with God. And you don't have relationship by doing nothing, right? Like, if you just don't cheat on your spouse, that doesn't mean you have a good marriage, right? Okay, you're not doing anything that would definitely ruin your marriage, but that doesn't mean that you have a good marriage, because there's a lot of stuff you probably should be doing, as well as some of that hopefully obvious stuff that you should not be doing, right? So there are things in a relationship you can do that will guaranteed sever that relationship, such as cheating in a marriage, right? That effectively, if you're found out, that in most cases that effectively ends the marriage, and probably should. Definitely, really, generally should. That doesn't make the relationship what it needs to be, but is a precondition for the relationship existing at all, right? That's what this is. This is like the bare minimum. If you veer into breaking these commandments, you are severing the relationship with God. This is like the bare minimum foundation of you are not going to be having a relationship with God if you're breaking these things. It's game over. But that doesn't mean that you have a good relationship just if you're not doing these things in these commandments, which is why when Jesus comes, he changes the language from thou shalt not, from negative language to positive language. This is what y'all need to do. But it is very important to be able to even have that conversation about what we should be doing to build the relationship, that we're not doing this stuff, right? Because these are like the deal breakers that mean no relationship with God can exist. So that's where we're at in this point in the people's journey with God, is we're creating the space in which a relationship can exist. We're doing it with the commandments. We're doing it with the setup of the camp and the liturgy and the implements that we use in the liturgy, and all of these things that we're going to be doing for much of the rest of this book that create space and separation between the ordinary and God are also intended to help us create that same space within ourselves, between the ordinary, the mundane, the broken parts of us, and a place where relationship with God can exist. And this is the purest reflection of that. It's not, hey, don't go into the Holy of Holies or you're going to die. That is a physical manifestation of the same reality here. Don't kill your neighbor or you're going to die. Don't covet, don't steal, right? These things are, in law form, the same idea of the separation of space between the tabernacle and where people live. So by following the law, we are, all of us, in effect, invited into the tabernacle, right? There's a way in which we can enter into the presence of God and the space where relationship can be built, and that is by our compliance with the law. But then we additionally have to take the steps of building the relationship, and Jesus comes along and shows us how to do that. But this is such an important framework, and that persists today, right? Like, this isn't just, they all did that, and now, Jesus is around, so he's my buddy, and now I can just go to heaven, because, he loves everybody, so I'm all good, and I don't have to worry about all that stuff. It is still true that violating these commandments puts us in a state where relationship with God is not possible. we still need to keep these in order to be able to enter into the tabernacle, into the space where God is, in order to build that relationship with God. And Jesus did not change that. It's just that with Jesus, once we get into that space, Jesus is there to help point us in the direction to go and to make it a lot easier. And we get do-overs, which we didn't get before, right? Before you violate one of these commandments, oh, you're done, right? There's the end of your opportunity to have a relationship with God for the rest of your life. You violated it, it's done. Jesus gives us do-overs, and he gives us something new within that space of keeping the law that allows us to. Holiness is not the end state, right? Being separated or set apart from all the rest of the things is a prerequisite to what we're trying to get to, but it is not the end in and of itself. It is a means. Being holy is a means to relationship with God. Relationship with God is the thing that we're going for, and that holiness enables us to have. Jesus creates a new way and a much richer and fuller way to have that relationship with God. And that's what we're going for. But to have any shot at that, we still have to keep these commandments. These have not gone away. These are very important. They're not there to damn us or to create, death. What they're still, as they ever were, they still are a pathway that hints at the possibility of life. And it's still a path that we all have to tread in order to find our way to life. So these are very important. It's hard to overstate. This is a very important thing that is happening here. And it's not an accident that this is the thing that happens as God tries to create a communal relationship all together with the people. Because this is how then you people in aggregate can have a relationship with God. So that's what we'll dig into here in this lesson, and we'll work through these commandments and what they mean for us. As we go through these commandments, there's not much text. I'm going to read them all as we talk about them. It's important, right? These are, as just discussed, these are important, right? And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. This is first for a reason, right? First point, right? Like, if this is a numbered list, it's not true necessarily that everything, as the farther down we get, the less important it gets. And it's in kind of two sections, how we behave toward God and how we behave toward other people. But, I don't know how many of you have ever, ranked things or started making, ranked lists of stuff. It's usually, in my experience, the things that are, most important are, and maybe the things that are worst or least important stand out clearly. And then in the middle, it's all kind of, just throw it all in, right? But even if, by and large, everything is mostly equal, your number one is still going to be the winner, right? So we're not going to worry about, beyond this first one, we're not going to worry about the order mattering in terms of importance, because, every single one matters, and violating any of them dooms you. So they're all pretty important. But if one could be said to be the most important one here, it is this one. It is number one. And it starts with, it's conditional, right? It's not just, you shall have no other gods before me. It starts with that reminder of here's why, right? And that's why God gets to give that command, right? Who are you, God, to say that you come before all these other gods? Well, I'm the one that brought you out of slavery in Egypt. You owe me, specifically, allegiance beyond any of these other gods who aren't real anyway, who haven't done anything for you because they're not real anyway. But we don't need to get into that too deeply now. The point is, what have they done for you? Nothing. What have I done for you? Everything. Who are you going to give your allegiance to then? Oh yeah, duh, me, God, who did stuff for you. And you'd probably like me to do some more stuff for you. How that works is you can't be turning to these other gods for stuff because they're not real and they haven't done anything for you, and I don't like it. But it also doesn't work. So it's stupid, it's ineffective, and it offends me who can help you. So let's just not do that, and maybe we'll get along a lot better, which on paper that sounds really easy. We're going to see them. The Old Testament is a case study in how that sounds really easy, and then like people just blow it. It reminds me a thing I was going to say in the introduction, but I forgot because there was a lot of other stuff going on. There is a component to which these are here, they're laying a pathway. It's not necessarily going to be followed right away, and it's going to fall on deaf ears for a long time, and God is potentially going to know that, right? Like the example from my life that I think of. Sorry, humans, for where we fall in this comparison. My cats like treats, as cats do. And, given their preference, they would be eating treats most of the time. I have created rules that originally I wrote down for the sake of people at my house to determine, when it's appropriate to give cats treats and when it's not. And we've got a series of rules. But I started also attempting to explain to my begging cats the rules and the situation behind why they're not currently getting treats. The biggest one being, if you're begging, you're not going to get treats, because I'm not going to teach you that begging leads to what you're trying to get. But there are others as well, mostly to protect my sleep schedule. Do I think that my cats really are going to be able to understand what I'm going for with those rules and to grasp them? No. Do those rules nonetheless, almost without exception, still govern whether or not my cats get treats? Absolutely. We as people, the authorities, in the case of that law, mostly are consistently following them unless somebody's being super cute. But generally, we're going to abide by those rules. So they exist and are in place, whether the cats understand them or not, right? Which is to say, that's also how law works, how these commandments work, right? God told us what they are. That is the case. He doesn't necessarily think that one telling of these things to these people is going to be, they're going to understand and go, oh yeah, I really shouldn't be worshiping these other gods. Thanks for telling me. Now I get it, and I won't do that anymore. And we'll be all good. And all of my children and their children and their children will also all be great about that. And we'll have no issues. And thanks God for telling me that. I didn't know that, and now we'll do that, and we're all good. God knows that this is going to be a journey, right? And this is going to be a process. And he's ready for that to happen. These are, again, if he doesn't tell us, we can't know. So he has to tell us. But just because he tells us doesn't mean we'll necessarily know. And kind of the history of these people is determined by how they're doing on especially this first commandment, right? You can map through the entirety of the Old Testament and into Christianity today as well, I'm certain, the history of how things are going for God's people based on how they're doing on commandment number 1. So then when it comes to our personal lives, we're like, there's a lot of other stuff competing for my demands here. And, I think it's kind of all equal. And God, I'll put you over here and you can fit in, with what's left over. So you read the Bible and you think, oh, those silly Israelites are once again turning away from God. We all know how that's going to end. That's so stupid of them. And then it's like, oh yeah, prayer, I'll do that, right before bed if I have time. And, yeah, my job's asking me to do some things that God wouldn't want me to do, but, I need money. And, I like a lot of the benefits that come with that. So like, God, understood your point, but I'm just going to do this, and then we'll put you over here. Or all of this sex stuff and these rules are like, yeah, God, I'm sure you have a point, but she's really pretty and she seems very enthusiastic. So I'll come back to you later. I'm gonna worry about this other thing right now, right? We do this, right? We can laugh at these people in history and how bad they were at doing this, but the same chart mapping how well things are going for you against how well you're doing on that first commandment applies in our own lives as well, right? It's just not we don't have deity names for these things that we put above God most of the time anymore, but it's still anything that you put before God is still a violation of this commandment. And when you're doing it, your life is going to start a not so subtle downward trajectory that's going to continue for as long as that's happening, until God gets your attention enough that you maybe try again a little bit. Not to say that God makes the bad things happen to you, by the way, that get your attention. You make the bad things happen to you. God's always there trying to get your attention. We become more receptive when everything goes to heck. All of a sudden, we're looking for external solutions to problems that we caused. And so we might pay a little bit more attention to God. But having no other gods before God is really no other things for us practically, right? So think about all of those places where maybe those of you watching this video don't have problems with this, never struggle with this, never do this. But some of us, I'm sure, do, myself included, where we put things ahead of God, right? Or move God off to the side so we can keep doing whatever it is. That's a no-no. That's a violation of number 1. That's the thing. If you can think of anything that in your life that causes you to, and this isn't even to say you're in total contradiction to God, right? It's just this is first and then I'll deal with God after this. That's the wrong thing, right? It doesn't have to be diametrically opposed to God. It can be anything in an attitude where you would willingly squeeze this thing in first and admit to yourself that, God comes lower at all. That's incorrect. And again, that erodes at the space where relationship with God can happen. If God's not first, you have significantly chipped away at your ability to have with him the relationship that he desires from you. It's not just he wants to get you because you split your attention, and yes, God is portrayed as jealous, but the reason for that isn't, he wants to monopolize your attention in your life, and how dare you think about anything else. It's the relationship that he wants to have with you is all-consuming, but opens you up to more capacity for other things, but he has to be first. If he's not first, that relationship can't happen as it's designed and intended because it is all-consuming. So when you put anything ahead of God, you compromise your ability to participate in that relationship with God. And that's the theme through all of these commandments, is if you're in violation of them, you're in some way cutting off your ability to have a relationship with God. You shall not make for yourself a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. This idea of a graven image is really an extension of the first one, right? Like, it doesn't mean that I can't like make a statue of my kitty, right? And just like, because I think cats are cute. But I definitely can't worship a statue of my kitty. This was before like photographs were easy, right? Or carvings were definitely not, right? So in general, the idea of these graven images is one of worship. And it's creating for yourself a thing that you give your worship to. That is an extension and one we're thinking about of the previous concept of, you can give your allegiance to the idea of money, but you can also like create for yourself specific things, like things you buy with that money that become the objects of your allegiance. Beyond just, it doesn't have to just be like a statue of Baal, right? It can definitely be like the house that I bought consumes my time and my attention, and man, do I feel good about myself because I have this nice fancy house, and doesn't that say so much about me? And I have a weird and unhealthy relationship with my house that's meant to be a relationship that I have with God, right? It can be things, not just abstracts, and also like physical things that come to occupy a place that belongs to God. And the commandments feel the need, because this one is so important, to specify neither one is okay. Just in case there was any doubt at all, neither one is okay. God has to come first, and God is a jealous God. But his mercy far outstrips his jealousy, right? Like, he's not, again, this is not here to punish these laws, right? Because the state of condemnation that you get if you violate the law is the same one that you had before. So the idea of God being jealous and these things, coming with consequences for generations, that's what people were experiencing. That's not new. The idea that keeping them is something that God will honor for many generations, that's the part that's new, right? I think we can easily dwell on, oh, God's doing all this negative stuff, but we'd already done that to ourselves. What God is doing is saying, yeah, but here's this. Why not that? And the mercy infinitely outstrips the punishment. Because the punishment we did to ourselves, the mercy God is doing for us. And God's mercy if we cooperate at all, can outstrip God's desire to love us and to give us grace and blessing, can overcome our own self-destructive natures. But we have to work with that. You still have to do the things, right? Too many people get this idea, and I probably rant on it too much in some of these videos, but get this idea that because Jesus came, we're all good and we don't have to worry about anything. And that is so far from the truth. He will do most of the work, but we still have like a lifetime's worth of work to do ourselves as well. And if you don't, then the outcome is not good. It is very possible in a world where Jesus has been raised from the dead to call yourself a Christian and to march merrily on your way to doom. And for being honest, I think a whole lot of people are doing that, like a staggering number in this country in particular. I think Christianity has become a thing we give a lot of lip service to and don't do a very good job of living. And I think that's become, unfortunately, the prevalent form of Christianity. And it's gravely dangerous to so many well-intentioned people out there that so much of that is happening. Which is why I hammer on the point, right? Like, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, right? It's not a thing to take for granted. Anyway, rant over, but do keep in mind, like, these commandments are non-negotiable and very important and are good for all of us to be reminded of. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Most commonly, we ascribe to this commandment, breaking of it, the thing where, you know, you like stub your toe and you say like the name of Jesus, right? Like, or God damn it about something that is like not a thing that you actually are trying to invoke God's damnation upon, right? As just a curse, right? And that's really not good. Don't do that. There's so much more to taking the name of the Lord in vain, though. And it ties into what I was previously saying, right? Imagine if you claim Christianity for yourself, you're literally taking God's name upon yourself as part of your identity, and then you go do whatever you want. That is further, and I would argue worse, taking the name of God in vain. Anytime you claim or invoke God's name, it needs to be with reverence and devotion, right? And anytime you're not doing that, whether it's in those offhanded curses, whether it's in claiming anything about Christianity when that's not what you're doing, there are a lot of flavors of how we can mess this one up. But the idea is that God is sacred, and the uses of every use of his name should be done in blessing, right? And we can turn it into curse or into something that's idle. It should always be fruitful, and it should always be in blessing. It should matter when we say it, which is why, like, in Mass and every other time when we say the name of Jesus, we're meant to be like lowering our head as a sign that this is a big deal that this was just said, right? For the Israelites, it became, and later the Jews, it became such a big deal that they wouldn't even say the name of God. And were willing to casually use it as a curse. That's not good. Don't do that. But also think about what you're invoking when, you know, if you're in a crowd, right? And, you know, you're at a party and you're having a conversation with somebody, and somebody over like 4 people behind you says your name. That gets your attention, right? It's a thing that's programmed to get your attention and to kind of interrupt what you're doing and to invoke you paying attention to it. Whether the person meant to be calling you or was saying something mean or nice about you. It's still, if you sort of hear it in the back of your mind, all of a sudden you're going to be paying attention. God is everywhere all at once and is paying attention to everything anyway, but it maybe a useful way of thinking about this is every time you invoke God's name, you are also invoking his attention in that capacity, right? Is this a thing you want God to be paying special attention to, that you stubbed your toe and that you're upset about it? No. So that's done in vain, right? That's a waste of invoking God's attention versus, you know, your sister's sick. Great, God, help with that, right? Good use. You're appropriately invoking God's name and attention to something that could use that is worth his time and energy. Think when you say the name of God about whether that context is something that is worth him paying special attention to. And if not, don't do it. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your manservant or your maidservant or your cattle, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. This one hits a little unfortunately because it's currently Sunday when we're recording this video and I'm planning to do work later. Because I feel like I have to. Cool, we do that as a society, right? So many of these things are about creating that space for God, right? He comes first, he's uniquely there. You're not in any way, shape, or form invoking that other than when it is really important. So you're putting limits on your speech that make even the name of God separate and significant and important. You create space in time where God is carved out. These are rules that are carving out God from everything else to again create that space for relationship. If the Sabbath day is like every other day, there is no more place for God in that than there is in any other day. And just going out on a limb, for the vast majority of us, that's not enough space for God. Right? He says, okay, 6 days are yours. Do what you need to do. I understand you need to work to live. Go for it. This one's mine. This one you separate out, and it's where we have relationship with God. And then, then if you don't do that, you're missing that vital area of connection with God. That is, you can't have a relationship without spending time, right? It's not just that on the Sabbath you don't do work. It's about what you are doing in the thing that you're not doing, right? Like if you set aside time that you're definitely not going out with friends or doing anything else so you can hang out with your spouse, and then you play video games by yourself the whole time that you have carved out to spend quality time with your spouse. Okay, great. You've not gone out and done other things. Kudos to you, I guess. But you also didn't fulfill the point either, right? You're not having that quality time that builds relationship. So it's not just, same deal here, right? It's not just about what we don't do on the Sabbath. That is, again, the thing that creates the space. You have to not do the other stuff. It's not, I'm not saying, and please don't interpret, oh, Matthew said it doesn't matter if you do some work on Sunday as long as you spend quality time with God. Because that's not the point, right? The letter of these commandments is, that's the bare minimum that creates the space in which something else can happen, but it's not itself sufficient. So, we should not work on Sundays or holy days. There's room to determine for yourself what work means in that context. And again, like if you have a question or on the side of being more conservative and doing less rather than the other way, that'll help you resolve any questions there. I've known people, and I try to do this myself, who don't engage in commerce on Sundays because they don't want to participate in other people working. And chores around the house, well, the list here is pretty exhaustive, right? If you read the commandment, God is like not only you, but like your servants, your sojourners, your animals. Like the exhaustiveness of the list is meant to emphasize like no workarounds, right? Like zero work done, like just by anyone, like no work. So interpretations of this probably ought to generally be, if it's a thing you cannot do, then there you go. Don't do it. I know, like, if you have a family, right, like preparing meals for your kids, do that, right? Like, there are obligations that still have to be done, but chores that can wait, they can wait. Maybe don't do that. Definitely actual work. The idea is you're trying to carve out that space, right? And what really matters is then what you do in that space that you carved out. If you just don't do anything, but then you sit on your couch and watch TV all day, you have still missed the point, right? Which doesn't mean you have to be like deeply reading and studying the Bible all day either, right? Because we can also, speaking from personal experience, use that as a distraction to keep from, you can very well be reading the Bible for 3 hours and have nothing to do with God in the time that you're doing that, right? Like the idea is to not to fill the space with things that are distractions, but to create the space and then to like go into the tabernacle and encounter God, right? However you do that. If reading the Bible is a meaningful and a good way for you to do that, great. If cooking a meal for your family is the thing that makes you feel really connected with God and like that act of service, then okay, great, do that. You want to get rid of the noise and the distractions and the things that pull you away from or occupy yourself and get in the space that otherwise could be left for God. There's a story about Padre Pio and a little kid going up to him. And I don't know if this is a real story. He has a lot of legends surrounding his life, but it's a poignant one, whether it really happened or not. So a little kid comes up to him and says, Padre Pio, what language does God speak? Does he speak Italian? And Padre Pio says, no, he doesn't speak Italian. And the kid says, well, then he must speak Latin then, right? Padre Pio says, no, he doesn't speak Latin. And the kid says, what language does he speak? And Padre Pio said, he speaks silence. It's in that stillness, in that silence, in that absence of activity that we can really find encounter and build some relationship with God. That's the goal of the Sabbath. However you do that, in the space you create, you're leaving it in a place where God can come in and you can encounter God. There is a caveat with this. There are situations in which it's not possible to not work on Sunday. I don't regard my current situation as that. I should have spent more time yesterday, and I didn't. I was working, but I didn't do enough of it. And you're right, I let the work spread out over the weekend, so it wasn't as bad on Saturday. And now I feel like I really have to do work on Sunday. That's bad, right? That's the kind of, you shouldn't do that. But if you are, for example, in a healthcare profession, if you're a shift worker who gets assigned work on Sundays and you otherwise couldn't keep your job or support yourself, right? There are situations where you have to work on Sunday, versus situations where you feel like you have to work on Sunday, but you don't. I feel like I have to work on Sunday. I don't, or I shouldn't have, and with better planning, I wouldn't have. Mine is not an acceptable situation. A lot of people are in a fine situation, and it's okay, right? If you can't keep this, then God understands. And then take that idea and shift it to some time when you can't set it aside, right? Don't do away with it because you work in a hospital on Sundays and you have to. Because if nobody did, then nobody could get emergency medical care on Sundays, right? That's not the... It's fine, right? There are circumstances where you have to. But if you do that and you have to, then don't say, oh, this doesn't apply to me then. So long, suckers, I get to do what I want. No, carve out a different time then, right? And make it consistent and make the effort to do it. Like, you're not absolved from needing to do this as a thing just because you are in a situation where you can't do it on Sunday. That would be my challenge, is if you're in a position where you feel like you absolutely are not able to do this on Sundays for reasons that are legitimate, and if you have a question about whether they are, talk to your priest, then do it some other time. Carve out another day. Don't not do it because of that, but it is okay to shift it. But the idea is, again, we're carving out, this is a weird phrase, we're carving out space and time for that encounter with God. And for that to be fruitful, we need to remove other things from it so that it can be as close as possible to just us and God. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Seems straightforward. Parents bring you into the world. They invest a lot in your upbringing, both in terms of time, hopefully love, resources, and you owe something back as a result of that, right? Like, it's not because of blood that family matters, right? Like, or common DNA. It's, these people caused you to exist, and then to some extent caused you to further continue to exist through their effort, and hopefully did much more than that for you as well along the way. And that comes with it, or that comes along with obligations back, right? It's not just, oh yeah, and now I'm 18 and see you later, I'm gonna go make my way in the world, and like, I don't owe you anything back for the fact that I exist, right? Like, the idea is that it goes both ways, and that there are obligations toward those who bring you into the world and do more for you. This interestingly does not talk about the obligations of parents toward children, which are also very much present, right? The idea is certainly that it goes both ways. And that brings us to where it's okay not to do this. There are parents who are awful and who are abusive, physically or emotionally, or who are terrible narcissists who will do nothing but ruin the lives of their children, etc., right? There are awful people who are parents who do awful things to their children. If you are one of those children, it is okay to cut off any relationship with your parent or parents, and you are not offending God when you do that, right? In some cases, the best way you can honor that relationship is by severing it. And keeping it from being unhealthy and destroying you. That's okay, right? Again, great thing to talk to your priest about if you're struggling with, because that's a very hard thing to do. But this is not, this commandment is not, God would not want this to be used as an excuse to allow abusers to continue to abuse. That is not the intention. The idea is loving parents come together, bring children into the world, help rear and raise them as, thriving, godly people. And as a result of that, there are obligations back toward the parents. The less, the parents do in fulfilling their obligations in that regard, the less is the less is then demanded of the child, right? If the parent is terrible, then pretty much they've gotten what they. I won't dwell on the point, but it's worth. I've heard this commandment used as an excuse for why people have to continue letting their very toxic parents be very toxic to them. And I don't think that's the intention. The idea is, though, they brought us into the world and we owe things to them, right? And that's fair, right? Parents who are doing a good job and give a lot to their children, yes, they chose to have the children, and the children didn't choose to exist, so there's more responsibility on the parent than the child. But there's responsibility that goes both ways. And if you depended on your parent for many years until you were able to get self-sufficient, and if once you are, you decide that means that doesn't go back at all, or that you don't have to listen to your parent or these things, you're doing it wrong, right? The idea of family is built around the mutuality of some amount of dependence and love. And the commandment points toward the directionality from children toward parents, but it implies, and it should also address parents toward children. And both sides are equally important to create that relationship. How does this relate to our relationship with God? So our relationship with our parents. Why does God care? And how does it relate to that? If you are going to be, and this is why it's the attitude of children toward parents, because we are, all of us, in our relationship with God as children, right? We're entirely dependent. God caused us to be, continues to cause us to be, and works to give us love and help us to thrive, and gives us guidance and direction in that regard. And the things that God has given to us make demands back on us, right? Our relationship with God in that regard is very fitting to call God Father. And so if we are not giving that due back to our parents, how are we ever going to recognize and give back to God the way that we're meant to, right? How we are in family is meant to be a mirror of how we are with God. And I would pose the idea that if you aren't doing it with your family, you can't do it with God. And so this is, again, a thing that creates that space for relationship with God to occur. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So, we have obligations, unique obligations toward family, just because of how that works. We also have just human level obligations toward other people. There are things you just this is the golden rule in action, right? Treat others the way you would like to be treated. And that is, that idea within and outside of organized religion is kind of treated as there's a word for it. There's a philosophical term for it. That's the ethic of reciprocity, right? There's, from an ethics point of view, God aside, just if we're all just people, this idea of treating other people the way you want to be treated is an excellent reduction of like just society, right? It's it is the best way for us to behave and exist in society. And when people stop doing that, things go badly. And it's taking advantage, right? These are different ways of violence against other people, whether it's physical violence or it's other kinds of violation or violence against other people that are not justified, right? How, again, can we have a good relationship with God when we are inflicting injustice upon others? We can't, is the answer to that. If you're oppressing or habitually doing wrong to your neighbors, anyone, then how, like, there's no place in that for God. And you won't be able to have that you won't be able to have a relationship with God. I mean, it's that straightforward, right? These things are all doing wrong by and harming someone that God loves as much as he loves you. How can you go before God in good conscience and say, yeah, God, we're good, right? But, I mean, I'm going to keep trying to get one over on Susie, and you're fine with that, right? Because we're so good. But God has the same relationship with Susie that he does with you. He can't condone that. If somebody is badly mistreating one of your close friends, what are the odds that you're going to have a close friendship with that person? You're not, right? Like, you're going to hold it against them that they're being mean to your friend, and you're going to be like, I don't like you. Everybody is God's close friend, at least in his conception of it, whether they want it or not. So if you're mistreating God's friends, how can he foster a friendship and a relationship with you? It's not fair to them. And God is fair. So you cut off. These are the things you can do that makes God less willing to engage in a relationship with you, right? Usually, like, the things you do that are only against God, he doesn't like, but he still wants relationship with you, right? He's still open to it and sees that you're harming yourself by not wanting that relationship with him. If you use God's name in vain, he still wants to have a relationship with you. If you're badly mistreating all of your neighbors, I would suggest he maybe wants less to have a relationship with. While you're doing that, while you're actively doing that, I would argue he does not want to have a relationship with you. He still wants you to repent, to stop doing that, and then for you to have a relationship with him. You're not like cut off from his love and his care and concern for you. But while you are doing those things, God can't have a relationship with you. It doesn't work that way. And that's why these are such important things, right? And specifically not just to how we interact with other people, but all of these commandments are about enabling us to have a relationship with God, right? This list, and I teased it before, is kind of traditionally divided into there are things we do for God and there are things we do for other people, but all of them are about enabling us to have a relationship with God and not doing things that would prohibit that kind of relationship with God. There are things we can do toward God that prohibit that. There are things we can do toward other people that prohibit that as well. I think that's the thing we don't dwell on as much, right? That how we treat someone else can cut us off from a relationship with God. Right? Because I'm entitled to that relationship with God, and if I want to have it, he's there, and it'll be available, and I can have it. Well, no, not necessarily. You can be such a jerk that he doesn't want that until you're not. So don't be a jerk. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. This is in its character, a little different from the previous one, right? Or the previous several commandments, the previous question. Because those were all ways that we do some kind of direct violence or wrong against other people. This isn't that. This isn't even necessarily the doing. This is the only one that of these commandments that has to do with our attitude rather than our action. Which makes it interesting, right? The commandment is to not covet. And coveting is not necessarily an action that we take. It can be an attitude that we have. Why does that matter? The short version is God gives us what we have, right? And if we're not happy in our lot and we want somebody else's, then that is that's overstepping, right? The thing that matters, again, is the relationship we have with God, not the stuff we have in this life. And starting to get bent out of shape about the stuff that we don't have poisons our ability to have a relationship with God. And it's not just that someone else has it, it's that I don't, right? Like, example, I'm very close to 41 years old at the time of recording this. I would very much like to be married. It's not like specifically, oh, the people in that house, Ben, yeah, I'd like to be married to her. That's the problem, right? That would be a bad problem. That doesn't help anybody. It certainly wouldn't help my relationship with my neighbor. But the thing that's toxic to my relationship with God is if I say, God, I'm owed and you should have given me this thing that you gave to somebody else. And when you start dwelling on and fixating on the things you don't have that you feel like you should have, well, God gives those things, and that seeps into your relationship with God, whether you want it to or not. For a long time, that idea did poison my ability to have much of a relationship with God. Is thinking about, these are I'd really like to have a significant other and to be married and to have all of that work, and it's not working. And God, that's not fair. And this is so missing the point, right? And it's that becomes the problem, right? It's not really that this specific neighbor has this specific horse that I want, right? Like that is a manifestation, but the attitude that leads us to say, no, I really want that particular horse and I'm not okay with what I have. The attitude that manifests as that covetousness for that one thing is the part that's a problem. That feeling that we are lacking and blaming that on God when he's providing for us, right? It creates a dynamic in which relationship with God as he wants it cannot exist. Because you're worried about, God wants to give you himself. That's pretty good. If you said, God, that sounds great, but I would really like $1 million instead. I think $1 million would be better than that. And that's the conversation that you have with God. How far are you going to get in relationship with God? Nowhere. And while we're not explicitly saying, most of us being well-intentioned aren't really saying, I want this instead. that is the implication, right? God has given you what he thinks you need. And if you say, I want that other thing, then you are saying, God, you're fine, but I want that instead of you. And as long as that is how can you have a relationship with God when you're doing that, right? Like, short answer, you can't. It undermines and compromises the relationship. So this goes back to the spirit of that first commandment, right? God has to be the thing that is first. And if there's anything that you would be willing to trade your relationship with God for, then you might not get the thing you trade it for, but you are going to lose the relationship with God regardless, whether you get the other thing or not. And that is not worth it. But there are definitely, I know we see people who definitely perceive, that's the sell your soul to the devil bargain that exists in popular culture, right? Is the thing that you can do, right? You trade their ability to have a relationship with God for whatever, right? Ability to play the guitar super well and to be a rock star, right? Is one of the ones that comes up sometimes, but there are a lot of other versions as well. The version as it exists in the culture is a little insidious because it implies that you'll sort of get the thing that you want, and not that just the willingness to make that exchange is enough that you already lose your soul, right? It's a lot worse and subtler how that forfeiture happens. If you would do that, you already have given up your relationship with God. And that's the point for reflection is, I think, probably, what would you trade God for? What are you trading God for? And do you mean to be? Because it can be kind of insidious how that works, and how other things, when we think we're all in on God, how other things can be compromising that. And that's where those things that we are envious or covetous of show us where we have work to do. Because those are things that we're then not satisfied with, and that are areas of weakness at best, and areas where we're compromised at worst. So we're done with the commandments, and now we're cutting back to the scene at hand, where Moses resumes talking to the people who have been witnessing everything that's been going on around this mountain, and the thunder and the lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And the people's response is fear. That is a healthy response in that situation. There's a reason that one of the things that God most commonly says to people is, do not be afraid. This is just God being present at a distance, not even up close. And it's that fearful. Imagine, it doesn't get better up closer, right? In that regard. They're just seeing like the after effects. And this is where a decision is made that sets the tone for how relationship with God is going to go through the entire Old Testament. The people see this, they're at the foot of the mountain, God is there, and they say, Moses, you deal with God. And then just tell us what happens. And we're good back here, right? You go be close to God, and we'll keep our distance. And they think, all of those things going on around the mountain suggest mortal peril, right? So they're afraid of dying. The irony of the situation is, as long as they're staying on the outside around the foot of the base of the mountain, they're already dead. The only way they could not be is if they go up the mountain to God. But the fear of death causes them to remain dead. And to say, Moses, you do this for us. And so only Moses has a direct relationship with God. And that continues and continues and continues. That these people need a mediator and in between them and God. And that is, it's tried in a bunch of different ways. For example, priests and prophets and kings and judges. And in varying flavors, it fails spectacularly. And a lot of pressure is put on those human people being asked to serve as intermediaries between God and his people. Those people are not set up to succeed, right? Like, no one succeeds at it, and the reason is no one can, right? This was a bad decision. Moses can't, David can't, Samuel can't, no one can. Ezra almost does, but also can't, but comes awfully close. No one can, right? The people were also more ready then. It's not apples and oranges, but no one can. It is an impossible thing for a human to do. So they make this decision here, and the framework it establishes is a doomed one. It can't work, but it's what we're doing. And that is kind of the story of the history of these people for a long time, is they need an intermediary between themselves and God, and nobody's capable of doing that. God solves that problem, right? The solution for that problem is if you have to have somebody that stands between you and me, and you can only, have this work if you have a direct relationship with me, then I'm going to give you somebody who is both an intermediary and me. And then this can work. But that's Jesus, and that comes down the road. And short of Jesus, this structure will not and cannot work. But it's very important that the people opted into this, right? They weren't willing to all of them together have a relationship with God. They chose their relationship with God come only through an intermediary and not directly. And that becomes every different stage of this people's development from here on out is different flavors of that structure of people, God, someone in between. And that never works. This part gets a little unclear about who's doing what, so I'll try to interpret a little bit. So, and the people stood afar off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you, Moses, shall say to the people of Israel, you, the people, have seen for yourselves, the people, that I have talked with you from heaven." That you is the part that's a little unclear, right? Is it Moses or is it the people? It could be either one. God did talk to the people, but he did it through Moses, right? Moses and Aaron were on the mountain. God spoke the commandments. They came down. The people, content around the base of the mountain, saw that God talked with Moses. They didn't hear that God talked with Moses, right? Or they didn't hear they didn't hear the conversation. They saw the conversation. They saw that God was talking. You have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. That last you could be, I've talked with you, the people, but they didn't hear it. They saw God talking with Moses. So from a blocking and tackling point of view, this conversation or monologue where God gave the commandments is not something that all of the people heard. It's something that seems like Moses heard and then was relayed to the people when Moses found his way back down. And then there's emphasis again, which is a little bit of dramatic foreshadowing. Moses has been up on the mountain, he comes down. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. This comes back around, right? Like, and we'll reference this again. There's an idea in the first 5 books of the Bible that sometimes the same story is told from multiple, like, authorial points of view, and like different versions of the same events are contained. So we don't have tablets here, we do have commandments. We don't have a golden calf made, but we do have Moses coming back down and saying, hey, you all really shouldn't be making idols of silver or gold. There are similarities between this and the thing we'll talk about later, that in part explain why that might be the thing that's emphasized here. But at any rate, that is emphasized here. Here we get separately to a thing that's very interesting because it's directly opposed to what we do now. Make altars of earth, don't raise them up, and definitely don't use hewn stones in them. If you go into a Catholic church, they are all on purpose raised up. And a lot of them are going to be made out of, almost all, not all, but the vast majority are going to be made out of cut stone. So how do we get from point A to point B? Or did we evil Catholics just go down the list and see this is what God says not to do for our altars, so that's exactly what we're going to do? Because, no, of course not, right? So how do we get from point A to point B? Hewn stones, starting point. What was the overall situation of these people right now? What did God decide to live in is I think the relevant question. He didn't have them build them a big fancy house, right? God is living in a tent. Why is God living in a tent? Because he is traveling with his people. The identity of God's people right now is intended to be, and never really changed from being intended to be, from God's point of view, traveling people, not settled down. What does it take to hew stones and set up an altar? That, even today, that wouldn't be a small chore. Back then, that would be a very big lift. You're going to be in one place for quite a while just to do that. And then after you do that, you're not going to want to just leave that altar behind, right? You're getting into constructing permanent edifices for the worship of God in fixed places, which lead to worship becoming centered around fixed places. God doesn't want that. He wants, you can move a bunch of earth together and you can have an altar, or you can set up some stones that are around and you can have an altar out of stones that just happen to be around. You're not doing a prohibitively large amount of work to set this up. You're not building lasting, fixed in one place geographical or infrastructure around the worship of God, right? I think that's the idea of the hewn stones. And at the point that David builds a temple for God, that kind of goes out the window, right? We change the rules and we're doing something else. So at that point, when we are worshiping God in a fixed location, it's okay at that point, or okay-ish, to set up and to build those things. It is not necessarily what God ever intended. the people went to God and asked for a king. God didn't say you all need a king and a city and all of those things. That was the thing that the people decided to do that God worked with. But we're not there yet. And the original vision seems to be the people might have been more mobile for much longer without really that same permanent place, which fits with our view as Christians that we are all just sojourners on earth, and that our true home and our lasting place is in heaven. But if that's true, right? If the true temple is in heaven, then that's where you would want to like set up something fancy, and anything else is just going to be ad hoc. Here we are. So that's why there would be a suggestion to not hew stones now. As for why are our altars raised? Ours are. It works so well that this is happening at the base of the mountain. Because our altars are raised specifically because this theophany happened in a mountain, right? Like you go up to be closer to and to be in presence of God. We do it symbolically so our altars aren't giant mountains, but the distance is symbolic of going up to where God is, right? And our priests go on the altar like Moses and Aaron went up the mountain. And who goes up and stands on the altar is meant to be restricted, right? It's not everybody. That is why there is an altar and rosary society. There were specific women in the parish who were given the mission of being able to go up on the altar to do altar decorations and the like. And that was a set apart and a special thing. It wasn't just about these are the people who are decorating the altar. It's about these are people who get to go onto the altar when most people should not go onto the altar under non-liturgical circumstances. It's a big deal. There used to be rails around it for that reason, right? Like to make sure people understood you're not supposed to just go here. This is a place you're not supposed to go. You can see it, but you're not supposed to go there except under certain circumstances. Because, again, it's like Moses and Aaron climbing the mountain. And it's reflective of what happens on our altars, right? In a Catholic church, you go up on an altar, you meet God, right? That's why there's the elevation. Well, if you're random Israelite, you're not meeting God on your altar. You're killing animals. You don't want any of that separation, right? This is bringing things down and making them accessible to the people. This is a thing that's meant to be open to and accessible for all of the people, and the priests and the Levites are people as much as anyone else, right? They have no claim. They didn't go up the mountain any more than anybody else did, right? Only Moses and Aaron, and later only Moses. There's no separation between the ministers of the covenant and the ministries of the covenant. They're all equal. So you better not be doing anything that puts yourself above the people that you're serving, because you wouldn't go up the mountain either. So stay down on your level and acknowledge that you and the people that you're serving are all on the same level. And when things go wrong, it's when the priests forget that. And it's not because they put a step up to the altar that's the problem. It's that they put a perceived status step between them and all of the people that they're priests for. And that is a problem. And so flatten it up, leave it flat. The same is true of our priests today, right? Like they're consecrated ministers of the new covenant, and they have specific liturgical roles in which they have a unique relationship and capacity with God. And the priesthood itself is therefore very much to be respected. But the individual men that are priests are not better, holier, above the rest of us because they are priests, right? It is the office that is imbued with special dignity. And the better that, of course, the man lives up to the office, the more dignity he has. But that is true of all of us in our vocations and calls of life, right? The better we live those things out in a godly way, the more dignity we have as people of God, right? And we are all equal in that regard. Priesthood, special thing. Priests, just guys. And you can do special things for your priest in recognition of the priesthood, and that's great. And God, I suspect, even approves of that. But when priests start to think of themselves as better than the people that they're priests for, in this or any other age, that causes problems. By brief way of summary, then, we have seen a lot here that has to do with creating relationship with God, right? Like, and rules and structure around that. Liturgy is going to, as we develop more in terms of liturgical rules and practices, as we develop smaller details about day-to-day life, following God's will and commandments, which we'll do in the next lesson. There will be many more things that elaborate on some of this structure and concept. All of it is about holiness in the sense of being separate or set apart, right? Carving out, sanctifying things that create a space within which relationship with God can happen. And for us, today, that is the most important takeaway of all of this kind of second half of the book of Exodus is what and how are we carving out things, spaces for relationship with God. And then what are we doing with that space once it's made? And that's the area of, I think, thought and reflection for us that's most relevant to us today. This has been an overview of Lesson 17 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the Book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.